In this world, is the destiny of mankind controlled by some transcendental entity or law? Is it like the hand of God hovering above? At least, it is true that man has no control, even over his own will. These are the words that introduce us to the cruel reality of Kentaro Miura's Berserk in its very first chapter, as well as the 1997 anime adaptation. The dictionary defines causality as the principle of cause and effect, the idea that all of life can be contextualized within the framework of cause and effect. Developments in the past of the human race are the cause of our evolution into a modern society, which itself is the effect of those developments. In turn, modern society would not have emerged as a mostly pacifistic space devoid of constant warfare had we not learnt from our history of bloodshed. Basically, everything you do has a cause and an effect on the world, and the relationship between those things is not individualistic, it is symbiotic. But Berserk takes this idea to another level by tying it into another concept that humanity has always concerned itself with, and that is fate. What is our destiny? Where are we fated to go? What are we destined to become? These are questions that often run through our minds as living, thinking individuals. And Kentaro Miura has used this basic truth of life to fashion causality into a terrifying, omnipresent notion that drenches the pages of Berserk with fear, paranoia, and enough bloodshed to make Genghis Khan look like a tame horseman. So let's get straight into it. This is the concept of causality in Berserk, explained. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. It was introduced as the idea of fate, causality's debut in Berserk. If you're like us and you know exactly zero Japanese or have only seen Berserk in anime format, then you would have been confused reading the Black Swordsman arc as well. Because in Berserk's first manga arc, causality doesn't exist. Instead, it's called fate, at least in the Dark Horse translations, but the idea behind the concept was introduced pretty well. After Guts defeats the Slug Count, he proceeds to basically torture the guy, and doesn't realize that his actions might just lead to the very people he's been searching for. The God Hand. Guts' unhinged speech to the Slug Count about the tenacity of the human spirit would have been nice if he wasn't also rapidly stabbing into his opponent while the latter's daughter looked on. The Black Swordsman must not have known that flowing blood and piercing despair are the requirements for activating a Behelit, because the Count started desperately crying out for life as his blood seeped into that astral key and summoned the God Hand. The first thing they do, apart from mockingly acknowledging Guts' pitiful existence, is to call the Slug Count he who was ordained by the laws of fate. Void explains to the Count, and us, the audience, that the former's desperate desire to cling to life had cleaved open space itself and summoned his kinsman from the bowels of the astral world. They had arrived here to grant him his deepest desire, but it quickly became clear that this whole fate business came with some rather horrific rules and regulations. First, you couldn't just sacrifice anyone, even though you were literally fated to make a sacrifice in order to transcend your humanity. It's because you were trying to escape it and freeze your heart to it that the sacrifice needs to be personal and tethered to your humanity. The Slug Count realizes that this means he's going to have to give up his daughter if he wants to live, and this makes him pause. He also cannot sacrifice Guts to save his own life because, simply put, Guts was already fated to die. As a bearer of the brand of sacrifice, Guts' flesh, blood, and soul now belong to demonkind. The fact that he was alive and standing on his own 2 feet was inconsequential because his fate had already been decided, and he would end up being a sacrificial offering either way. Curiously, Guts' gutsy standoff with Griffith earns him admirers amongst the God Hand, chiefly Slan and Ubik, with the former outright stating she wants him to become one of ours. But Conrad points out that Guts hasn't been ordained by the laws of fate, so he cannot join them. So far, the idea of fate has been presented as a set-in-stone kind of deal. Things that cannot be changed will not be changed, and things that cannot be avoided will not be avoided. But then, a curious thing happens when fate is avoided immediately after establishing its permanence. Void performs the Invocation of Doom and prepares to brand Teresia as the Count's second sacrifice. To help him make the decision, Ubik gives everyone gathered an AV presentation of the Count's first sacrifice, where he was all too willing to embrace his fate as an apostle. The God Hand continues to pressure the Count into sacrificing his daughter by summoning the Abyss and showing him the ultimate fate of all those who get tangled with demonkind. He is about to give into their pressure when he realizes his soul will be stuck in the eternal swirls of the endless abyss, but he stops short of uttering the sacrificial phrase when he sees his daughter. This causes the fiery brand of sacrifice symbol floating in front of Tiresias' face to disappear with a sudden pop as Void proclaims that the thread of fate has been severed. He of course means that the Count chose not to sacrifice Tiresias in order to ascend twice, but that proclamation isn't exactly accurate because the Count does end up succumbing to fate. Immediately after rejecting the God Hand's proposal, the Count's soul is dragged into the abyss by its infinite number of miasma-filled residents, which fulfills his eventual fate as one who had given himself over to demon kind. The God Hand had explained to us previously that all those who are tangled with their kind will eventually end up in the abyss, for that was their fate, as entities in service of evil. This fate ultimately came true for the Count. In the end, all that was left of him was his dismembered body and his broken castle. His soul, along with all of the things that made him a person, was dragged into the abyss, and the dead started dragging Guts along as well, for he too was ultimately fated to join them. Guts survives thanks to his trusty arm cannon, but he doesn't exactly free himself from the grasp of fate. He only gives himself a temporary reprieve. We understand just how intrinsically linked the idea of fate and a person's actions are when we get to the eclipse, where the term fate is finally swapped out for causality, as evidenced by Void's lengthy monologue to Griffith. A current so strong it sweeps everyone and everything along with it, but it isn't immune to leaping fishes. Causality's true purpose in Berserk. The term causality becomes a part of Berserk's vocabulary during the eclipse, where it was first used in the sense it is understood today. When Griffith triggered the interstice and summoned the God Hand, the first thing that Void does is welcome the lambs of the ungodly god born of man, aka the Apostles. He tells them to enjoy the feast that's yet to come to their heart's content, before pointing towards Griffith and calling him the child consecrated by the laws of causality. This is pretty much the same thing he said to the Slug Count, minus the elaborate greeting, which is how we know that the idea of fate and causality are practically one and the same in Berserk. Void then goes on to proclaim Griffith as the guest of honor of this feast because they'd arrived for his eclipse after all. Void calls Griffith's kinsman to the God Hand, which makes Guts lose his cool because he can't imagine his beloved leader becoming one of these things. He starts protesting and outspokenly denying the idea that Griffith could turn into a monster like the Apostles or the God Hand themselves, but Void quiets him and informs all gathered that all lies within the current of causality. As an example, Ubik explains to Griffith that since he came into possession of his Behelit, he had the qualities to become a demon, or rather, because he had those qualities, the Behelit found its way to him. Shortly before he activated it, in the middle of a mental breakdown, Zod had told Griffith that his Behelit would return to him at his most desperate hour, and that's exactly what happens right before the eclipse, as Griffith's crimson Behelit surfaces from the depths of a lake just as he starts losing his mind for good. One can say this return was fated, because according to Void, everything has been determined already by the concept of causality. The lives of the entire band of the Falcon had been woven together to reach this point of critical mass known as the eclipse, and it was now time to tempt fate itself and see if Griffith was going to stand upon his destiny or chicken out like the Slug Count. Void calls for the invocation of doom and separates Griffith from his band, including Guts, who had been holding on to him. Then, Ubik gives Griffith a stroll through his consciousness and presses him into accepting the fact that he'd always known his path to his dream would be built upon thousands of corpses. The God Hand then empathizes with Griffith's ambition and tells him if he wants to, he could bury everything in the ruins of his dreams, including himself, by simply giving up on it and accepting his demise. But if he still saw that castle of his dreams dazzling within his mind's eye, then Void would encourage him to pile up the corpses so he receives raven black wings upon which he can then soar to the highest summit. He says that if it is reason that makes destiny transcend human intellect and make playthings of them, then it is cause and effect that a person bears and confronts the evil within their hearts. This is the key statement that explains causality's application in Berserk if you disregard chapter 83 like the official continuity does. Griffith is moved into action by Void's monologue about destiny and dreams, and decides he will sacrifice his men by his own will, but then he descends into the abyss and discovers that his will is nothing more than an extension of the idea of evil, which is the ultimate embodiment of all things evil in the world of Berserk. When Griffith is confronted by the idea, he is shocked to see God with such a hideous form. The idea is nothing more than a massive human heart covered with eyes and a double helix extending from its base into apparent nothingness. Yet this idea was created not by some supreme entity, but by humans themselves. Void calls the idea the ungodly god born of man because it derives its existence from mankind. The idea of evil explains that it was born because humans desired reasons to explain their sufferings, and that it is the entity that gives them those reasons by weaving together the threads of fate and producing causality. For example, Griffith always thought that he was different from others because he had always had a striking effect on anyone he met, and his ambitions were higher than anyone else's. He thought of himself as a part of this world's golden elite, as a key who made it progress, despite not having the social standing to do so. Now, he finds out that his entire life had been manipulated up to this point by a giant floating heart, and with that knowledge, his very self-concept crumbles. The idea of evil explains that Griffith's ascension was an event that was decided upon centuries ago, because the idea was the one who facilitated his birth. It merged blood with blood to form the lineage that would lead to Griffith's birth, and created the context that was his life for him to eventually accept his destiny as a god hand. Griffith then does something he has never done before, and asks God what it wants from him, clearly giving over the reins of his destiny to this entity. But then, the idea asks him to do as he pleases, reaffirming Griffith's convictions in his own actions and pandering to his egotistical side. The idea claims that it is a part of Griffith, and Griffith is a part of him, so Griffith's actions, while being motivated by his individual will eventually end up having a massive impact on the happenings of the world. And they do, because Femto's birth marks the advent of the prophesized Age of Darkness. Ever since Griffith became the 5th Demon King, the God Hand, or rather the idea of evil's grand plan, has been seemingly unstoppable. The incarnation ceremony went without a hitch, if you ignore the demon child. The advent of Fantasia went just as the God Hand had planned, with Femto avoiding Skull Knight's spatial attack and using it to trigger the great roar of the astral world instead. The creation of Falconia and Griffith's subsequent rise as humanity's sole leader, all of these things were apparently predetermined by causality. But despite being a current that is so strong that it can sweep up entire generations within it, causality is not entirely inevitable. The proof is the fact that Guts and Casca survived and made it out of the eclipse. Aside from the God Hand and the Apostle Zod, the only other person we've seen capable of deducing the flow of causality to a certain extent is the Skull Knight. Skull Knight too thinks of causality in pretty definite terms, as his first appearance in the manga shows him warning Guts of the impending doom of the eclipse. Zod had said the same thing to Guts during their first encounter before calling things off, so naturally the 100-man Slayer became apprehensive of his own demise. But then, Skull Knight managed to save Guts and Casca from being devoured by the Apostles, and he even claimed that it wasn't their time to die, suggesting the branded pair were a part of causality's plan. Yet when Guts manages to continually thwart the God Hand and defy fate by staying alive, even this wandering wraith has to admit that Guts might not be a struggler without the agency to solve his own issues. Before the incarnation ceremony took place, Skull Knight appeared in front of Guts to warn him of Griffith's impending incarnation. He started talking about the inevitability of the ceremony itself and how it was akin to the reflection of moonlight upon the surface of a stream. The incarnation ceremony traced a phenomenon that took place within the divine domain, aka the astral world, and so there was no way for humanity to change its course. But then Guts reminded Skull Knight that he himself had prophesied Guts' death, and he was still standing on his own 2 feet. This makes the Wandering Wraith rethink his opinion on causality and alter it slightly to fit Guts' unique life experiences. He thinks that instead of being a shadow on the powerful stream that is causality, perhaps Guts was a leaping fish who could, occasionally, break its surface and disrupt its entire flow. He admitted to Guts and then himself that the God Hand were not omniscient, though that's something they'll be quick to own up to as well. But he also says that it is possible that at critical temporal junctions, a single individual's actions might end up changing the flow of the stream of causality, because that's exactly what seems to happen whenever Guts shows up at a demonic ceremony. At Griffith's eclipse, he was supposed to die, but he survived. At the incarnation ceremony, Casca was supposed to die, but she is saved by his party, and then his demon child merges into Femto's incarnation vessel, leaving him with the handicap of transforming into the Moonlight Boy every full moon. Guts' leaping fish effect on the current of causality is not going unnoticed by its biggest proponents either, as every time Void sees the guy defy his destiny, he goes dead silent. Flora once told the Skull Knight that causality is not a circle as many people believe. In her interpretation of the concept, causality was more like a spiral which mirrored events from the past in the current timeline, but whose outcomes would ultimately be entirely different. Guts is not who Skull Knight was, and so his fate might be radically different from the latter's. Flora believes that while causality does have a grand plan for folks, jokes, it is ultimately a conditional plan, because it will never come into effect if the person doesn't accept it themselves. She says that it is ultimately man himself that chooses their fate, and this is perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind with Berserk's idea of fate. Griffith became a God Hand member out of his own will, sure, but he was manipulated into picking that fate by only being reminded of his deepest desires and blocking out any human connections he'd formed along the way. He was already on the verge of a total mental breakdown as it is, so we can't even say he made the decision to sacrifice the Band of the Falcon entirely of his own volition. Manipulation and causality were definitely involved in his ascendance, and Griffith chose to give in to the fate decided for him instead of choosing to continue living what he deemed to be a worthless existence. Marvelous verdict. Causality might be something unchangeable in the minds of most people who read Berserk, but Miura-sensei gave us enough hints that it was not as foolproof as people think it is before his untimely passing. Now all that remains to see is how Kujimori brings Berserk's core philosophical theme to a satisfying conclusion, because as of this moment, all is flowing according to Causality's grand plan. Griffith has kidnapped Casca, destroyed Elfhelm, left Guts in a sinking boat, and is now preparing to head east for his next campaign. We're gonna have to wait until May 26th to see what he means by that last statement, but until then, let us know what you think about the causal current down in the comments section below, and we'll see you guys in another video real soon. But if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, be safe out there, and have a marvelous day.